So the talks really are here to remind us or to describe life um, differently to the way that we tend to fall into life. So it's a reminder that happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind is available to us. It is a way of being in life that can happen. And it's important to hear that. Otherwise, if we don't know that there is some other way, then we might never hold that as something interesting. And if we hold that other way, the description of the other way, i.e. living life happily, as something interesting, if it really is available, then by holding it as something interesting, there's probably more likelihood that we're going to move in that direction. So the talks are about happiness in daily living. And happiness is not about a ecstatic feeling or a joyful feeling or being positive and exuberant and bubbly in the life of the party. That's often what we would call happiness, because we have come to see happiness as being a positive and pleasurable feeling, and looking at unhappiness as being the opposite. So we tend to think happiness is pleasure and unhappiness is pain. Whereas the happiness that is being described here is happiness through peace of mind. And peace of mind is the absence of an uncomfortableness with oneself, not the absence of pain. Uncomfortableness with oneself and pain are different in quality, different in structure, different in nature. Pleasure and pain is part of the biological occurrences of the body, and we can have physical pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, financial pleasure or pain, and that's essentially circumstantial. And then there is our attitude to the circumstance, and that is another layer of life. So we could say that the life experience relevant to this discussion is made up of two layers: the flow of life and our attitude to the flow of life. And our unhappiness exists on the layer of our attitude to the flow of life, and our happiness also is to do with that layer of our attitude to the flow of life. It turns out that human happiness is just the absence of the unhappy attitude to the flow of life. And unhappy attitude really means a feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself, what we can call suffering. And it's psychological suffering. It's not the suffering of having a headache or the suffering of having lost loved ones, or the suffering of not having enough food to eat. Those things I've just mentioned are circumstantial pains. The suffering is how we relate to those pains and what we think that means about who I am. Who I am, who am I? This is a question that's being referred to as a fundamental question when it comes to self-inquiry, to understanding oneself better. Who am I? And the what we can describe as the false sense of who we are, the mistaken sense of who we are, includes a sense of who we are that is heavily enmeshed, invested, intertwined, dependent on circumstance being a certain way. And the truth is we exist independent of circumstance. Now that's a concept, it's a statement, so it's going to be accurate when understood a certain way, and then also it can be said to be inaccurate, because the truth is we never exist while circumstance doesn't exist, so we coexist with circumstance. So what does the statement that we exist independent of circumstance, what it's really saying is that we exist regardless of what the circumstance is. So our existence in daily life is not dependent on circumstance being pleasurable instead of painful. We exist in both circumstance. And we might think, yes, I exist, but I exist in a diminished capacity when circumstance is painful. And therefore, when circumstance is painful, I don't really exist in the same way as when circumstance is pleasurable. And that is when we know ourselves incorrectly. When we come to know ourselves more deeply, we realize that there's a core of the human being that is untouched by circumstance, that is complete and available all the time. And a resting there, a discovering that place, a resting there, means a dropping out of attachment to circumstance. And so that dropping out of attachment to circumstance really means a quietening down on the psychological level. Because the voice, the commentary that seemed necessary when we knew ourselves as something dependent on circumstance being a certain way, which meant when that's how we know ourselves, the voice is forced to arise and judge the circumstances being appropriate or inappropriate, depending on whether it was deemed to have added or taken away from who I am. And when it becomes clear, starts to become clear that involvement in life, that psychological involvement in life, is the uncomfortableness that disturbs what is being described as peace of mind. And peace of mind is this quietening down of the psychological me, the thinking mind. So the psychological me and the quietening down of that psychological me turns out to be the unlikely, or the happiness that is being spoken about, that we don't at all consider to be. That's not where the thinking mind imagines happiness to be found. It doesn't imagine happiness to be found in that form. It's never really thought of happiness being the absence of suffering. It's always assumed happiness is the outward movement. the outward movement towards gaining something. And so a change is only going to happen if we start noticing that our unhappiness in life is this commentary, this involvement in life. An involvement that sees the other essentially as a competitor, a rival, an enemy, and sees oneself as also something that can get in the way of our happiness. So whenever actions happen through us in a way that doesn't deliver an outcome that we imagine will lead to our happiness, then there is a self-hatred. So when we hear about silence and stillness, it isn't so much talking about a circumstantial silence or stillness, but rather a stillness of the psychological me, a stillness of the thinking mind, a silence of the thinking mind. So that commentary can be visualized as a disturbance or a storm in the mind of the person, because there is this identity that is not comfortable with itself and is not comfortable with life, and therefore is active and storm-like. And peace of mind is the quietening down of that, and a stilling of that, a silence. And so it can coincide with us being still and silent physically, but it can persist as a psychological silence while the body is performing whatever it happens to need to do in the circumstance, which sometimes will dictate that the body is active and functioning in relation to a practical task. And so really the stillness and the silence is talking about the commentator, the psychological me that is often in resistance to life, is complaining a lot of the time about, all sorts of things that it comes across in life. And a stilling of that is such a relief. And when we look closely at it, we find that the complaining is essentially a expression of an uncomfortableness that is triggered by a circumstance. It creates an uncomfortableness, and to say nothing means the uncomfortableness remains bottled inside. And so often our complaining or our thinking, which is a form of complaining but in non-verbal form, that is essentially a transmuting of the uncomfortableness with oneself into a verbal form to try and use up that energy. So the complaining or the blaming or the expectation or the anxiety and worry tends to reduce as the uncomfortableness with being in life reduces. And that uncomfortableness reduces when we come to know ourselves differently. And knowing ourselves differently really means that a different, or that the human being with its very complex structure transforms and changes. And in particular, there's one part of the human being that changes such that we can say we know ourselves differently. And so I would say it's the psychological me that changes in structure. And as that psychological me changes, there is less of an identity to be challenged by life circumstance. There's less of an identity that then therefore feels uncomfortable. And because there's less uncomfortableness, there's less energy that needs to be transformed into certain speech, certain thoughts, or certain behaviors. So to try and put a lid on the thoughts, the speech, the behaviors, without the psychological me changing would be to create a sort of pressure cooker situation. And it wouldn't be sustainable. It would require effort of a doer to, let's say, not complain. But if the identity is being challenged by circumstance and there is an uncomfortableness, and then we cut off the expression of that uncomfortableness, what will happen is the uncomfortableness will actually remain in an even more, a place where it will feel even more uncomfortable for longer. So the complaining, the thinking, the behaviors are actually the complete expression of that uncomfortableness. And the uncomfortableness stems from this psychological me that is in place. So the real answer is not to try and force ourselves to change our behaviors, but rather for life to change the structure, the psychological me structure, that then really just means that there is a changed entity or a diminished entity that life whacks up against. And when that psychological me identity is completely dissolved, then the circumstance part of life continues to unfold, but the attitude is not the attitude of the psychological me towards life, but rather the attitude of the absence of the psychological me. So the psychological me is in resistance with life, is judging life, is blaming the other, is feeling shame and guilt for not doing believes we should be doing. So that psychological me is continually at odds, essentially, with life, with its expectation. And the absence of that psychological me is exactly that, the absence of the noise, the absence of the identity is being challenged by life. And so life circumstance is still going to be more or less the same. People are still going to not do what they said they were going to do, and the weather is not always going to be perfect, and we're going to be physically unwell from time to time. And so we might say, well, how can it be that the circumstance is more or less the same and things are still happening to the body, and yet there isn't a resistance? And the answer is to see that there is the biological aspect of the body, and that body is actually part of life, not separate from life. It is like like a piece of seaweed or grass in a river, and it is just part of the overall ecosystem of the river. It's not separate. So it is in flow with life, and it is one part of life. It's not separate from the river, and the human being is the same. It is in movement in life, and it is part of life. So circumstantially, we have one level, and then the attitude is an attitude that creates an entity, a psychological entity that is swimming against the current. And so if that psychological identity dissolves, we still have the same circumstance, but without the psychological resistance. So we could say that in the absence of the psychological me, the doer, the identity, the belief that is attached to life being a certain way because it feels its completeness is to be found in outcomes, there is the allowing of life to flow. Now, even when that's there, life is still flowing. The flow of life is still happening. It's just that that attitude is an attitude of, finding fault. And so it creates the sense of butting up against life. Now, this attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcome, which really is this psychological me, is based on the belief that what I am is this biological person, this biological instrument. And the belief that is part of the person says, well, I am the driver of the bus. I am the one that is controlling what I as the person does. And so it has its ideas of how it should act. And then it finds that the person either acts in line with its shoulds and shouldn'ts, or it doesn't. And very often, the shoulds and shouldn'ts are essentially an expectation of how life unfolds, and we're not in control of what that storyline of life is. We're not actually the controller of the biological instrument, and so it's either good luck or bad luck as to whether the biological instrument actually functions in line with the shoulds or shouldn'ts. And if it doesn't, then there is this judgment of oneself, and the oneself is that psychological me that says, oh, I didn't function as I should have. And the absence of that psychological me sees life as a happening, sees thinking is happening, speaking is happening, talking, eating, sleeping, watching television is happening. Emotions are happening, feelings are happening. So what does this things are happening is essentially pointing to the non-personal mechanics of how life unfolds. And the psychological me doer, this idea that arises that says I, and this I business is part of that idea. I am controlling what happens, and that's a fiction. Life is happening. Thinking happens. So we're convinced it's my thinking. Who's thinking? We go, me, the body that is in control of the thoughts that I have. And that's the psychological me that life has put in place. So we need to see it. So the words are just pointers. to a dynamic that is been set in place. And to the extent we see it, it's not saying change it. It's saying see that the body functions according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning exist even if that psychological me isn't there. And so we will continue to function and always have functioned, the body, according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's like a computer or a machine. And the idea that I, as this idea of a controller, is simply not seeing the mechanics. So the human being in each moment is one way. What I mean by one way means the design, the structure, hugely complex. I mean, if we talk about neurons and cells, there's millions and billions of neurons and cells in the human structure, but they're all in alignment with each other in a particular way, following a biological blueprint. And that wasn't my doing. That came into existence and is in existence in each moment, a particular way. And that structure dictates the movement of the body. So this is something that, well, I think we can understand intellectually. I don't think it's really complex, actually. Just the description that the body is a very complex biological instrument, just like a plant is a complex biological instrument or biological organism. A human seems to be more complex than a plant, especially when you start looking at the brain. Is very complex, but essentially in principle, the principle is the same. It's a biological organism that is as complex as that organism is, and the organism functions according to its design and structure. This isn't even a discussion about whether consciousness is of the body or not of the body. What we're talking about here primarily is the biological and psychological movement, so the speaking and the feelings and the thinking. So we're really talking about the biological instrument on a biological and psychological level, which clearly is dictated to primarily based on what we can call combination of genes and up-to-date conditioning, which essentially genes and up-to-date conditioning means how the instrument has reached its current form. So the sperm and the egg come together and form a genetic blueprint, and that blueprint grows and is growing in an environment, impacted every single moment by the environment. And so the growth is a result of the genetic structure plus the environmental impacts. And those are the only two factors in the human development: genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of the new conditioning that comes in each moment, moment after moment after moment. So we have the new conditioning from our friends and family, from the school we go to, the political situation, the cultural situation of the country or town that we grow up in. And these are factors that we weren't in control of. We weren't in control of which parents we were born to, which school we go to, which friends we make. and which teachers we have, which priests or rabbis or imams, whatever the religious leaders are. All of these are part of the environment. So if we can start to have an attitude to ourselves as being a result of life, I am a result of life. So no space, if that becomes seen in a fairly full way, there's no space for the attitude of shame. Because shame implies or includes in it the notion that I have not done a good enough job, that I am not good enough of my own doing. So if we can appreciate that I am a result of life and the other is a result of life. If the other's being really embarrassing to themselves or obnoxious or whatever, and we can see there is no other as a separate doer. There is life having arranged itself in a certain pattern. That is the person in that moment. And that pattern is functioning. So compassion comes from that attitude. And so we can have compassion to ourselves. So we can see an outcome that happens through us. We can make a decision that we think is a good decision. And in hindsight, we see it clearly led to an unfortunate circumstance or an unfortunate consequence. And if we have this attitude towards ourselves and towards the other of not being the doer, that was part of life, that we are part of life, and the decision was part of life, and it was the only decision that instrument, given its structure and the circumstance it found itself in, could make, because that was the decision it made. So if it made a different decision, if we understand how decisions and information is crunched, then we'd say, well, the computer crunched all the information it had and came up with that answer. And the answer is its action, for example. And so if we understand this, we say, well, it can't possibly come out with a different answer unless the variables are different. Now, the variables being different means the structure needs to be different or the circumstance is different. And so if the circumstance or person were different, then yes, a different action could have happened. But given they were what they were, the outcome is a result of them being what they were, of the circumstance being what it is and the person being what it is. So we couldn't possibly expect a different outcome. So compassion is exactly that, seeing that. So I would always, when we talk about understanding wisdom, it's very often the absence of ignorance. So the lack of compassion is seeing oneself as the doer and seeing the other as the doer, and then hating the other or hating oneself. And compassion is the absence of that hate. It's also what we could call acceptance. So compassion and acceptance are not that far removed, when acceptance is really the absence of non-acceptance. So if we're not accepting life, we're essentially got an attitude that is saying it could be different or it should be different. So that attitude is not appreciating the fact that in each moment life is a result of everything that came before. So when it says it should be different, it could be different, it has an idea of how things happen that is out of line with how things actually happen. And if the computation of how life happens changes, then that particular human being can't think, oh, life should have been different. Because essentially what we're saying when we say life should be different is we say we would like, if we're following the model that the universe of time and space and causality that we know, that we live in, if we say it started with the Big Bang and then was a expansion from that point up to this point, when we psychologically say that shouldn't have happened, life should be different, we're saying, oh, the Big Bang should be different. We don't realize that's what we're saying, but that is what we're saying. We're saying, well, something at the beginning of time or in between the beginning of time and now needs to have been different to what it was, because that's the only way that life in this moment could possibly be different. So this is what's meant when we say life is a predetermined story unfolding. It means from the perspective of the one aware of life, the one that can either be silent or complain. From the perspective of that one that is aware of the situation, life was predetermined to turn out that way. And the understanding understands that, and so remains quiet. Remains quiet simply means the absence of the insistence, the psychological insistence that life be different. Because it doesn't make sense to think that if life is seen as an unfolding that started 14 billion years ago at the beginning of the universe. And so what life in this moment is the crest of the moving wave. And we are always aware the present moment is the very edge, crest of the wave. That is never static and always turning into the crest of the wave. So if we start to see for ourselves all of the commentary that feels uncomfortable in its core, that is based on not appreciating, not remembering that life is a predetermined story unfolding, and that what I am is part of the story, that I am not the doer of the story, not the doer of the actions of the human being, but that which is aware of what is happening in each moment. And the more we become aware of this uncomfortableness, that is forgetting that, the more likely it is to be interfered with, to be cut off. The more likely it is for a part of our thinking to kick up and say, actually, I'm not the doer, that life is unfolding according to God's will. And that thought, that reminder within ourselves can cut off the hatred, the blame towards the other, the regret about the past, the complaining about the present. Now, there are going to be people that will listen to the description and says, I'm not the other. I'm not the doer of what happens through me. And so that doesn't mean I'm not the one that cuts the cucumber when the cucumber gets cut. the body clearly is cutting the cucumber. What it means is that if the cucumber is getting cut and then the tip of the finger also gets cut, that was happening, that had to happen that way, and it wasn't because the body chose for that to happen. At least if there was, if we look at a different example where, you know, the body chose to add a liquid into the food being cooked, and then it realizes that that's vinegar and not sugar, let's say. There was a choice to add that liquid, but it was happening exactly the way it was destined to happen given the circumstance and the makeup of the person. So we could say there is the choice. The body looks at the two bottles and thinks, oh, that's the sweet syrup, and turns out it's adding vinegar. So there was a choice, but the fact that a mistake was made was not the doing of any individual with complete autonomy over what it picks. So if I describe that I'm not the doer of what happens, and the other isn't the doer of what happens, that to me is a description of what we can see life to be when we acknowledge certain dynamics and certain structures, and how those structures play out, what laws determine the playing out. Now, someone might hear that and just not like the sound of it, because it says, well, I don't want to hear that we're not in control. It says, oh, that's a very good excuse. I said, what if it's true? So why someone might not like the sound of it is because they imagine the other not being in control, not being the doer. And so then they imagine, well, in that case, the other could do anything to me. And so that's just too uncomfortable to the me, the psychological me, that may be part of the listener's structure. And that psychological me believes that its completeness is to be found in life one day cooperating and being pleasure, 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 which means the other being in control is what that attitude is saying. I need the others to actually be in control so they could just possibly do what I want them to do. So this description that I'm not the doer of what happens through me can just be too challenging for someone to hear because it doesn't make them feel safe. So they'll say, oh no, that just sounds like an excuse for someone. If someone believed that, then they'll do all sorts of irresponsible things. I say, well, that's not why I'm saying it. I'm just trying to describe the mechanics of life as I see it. Now, just because the description or the actual mechanics of life might not make you feel good, doesn't mean that I should change the description or the way life is seen. And in fact, it might be useful for you to see that the truth is you don't like the sound of it because it doesn't make you feel good, not because you've investigated it and found it to be wrong. And so much of the resistance to, let's say, these descriptions are not because the person has investigated it and found it to be wrong, but it just doesn't make them feel good. It doesn't make the me doer that is listening feel like, yes, finally I see light at the end of the tunnel as to how my happiness, which I believe is to be found in outcomes and controlling my life such that one day it's exactly the way I need it to be. The description I've put forward doesn't make them feel all warm and fuzzy. In fact, it does the opposite. It makes them feel like there is no light at the end of the tunnel. The good news is that along with a seeing of life this way, so when someone finds that destiny is such that they say, okay, I'm interested in just being open. It makes me feel uncomfortable, but let me check because I'm interested in knowing how things actually are rather than holding some misguided belief just with the hope that it makes me feel more comfortable. The good news is that as we investigate life and start to see more clearly, the psychological me tends to get squeezed out. And what we find is something remarkable, which is, oh, my happiness is not dependent on circumstance. As the psychological me gets squeezed out, we start finding that there is this capacity to rest in a dimension of the human being that was obscured and unavailable previously because of all the blame and shame and expectation and worry and anxiety, what have you. And so as that gets squeezed out, we start getting glimpses and realizing that the happiness I was always looking for was never to be found out there in outcomes in the future, but that it is to be found in a radically different way, right here, without life circumstance needing to become perfected or ideal. It's to be found here when the human being quietens down, which really means when psychological me dissolves. And seeing life as a predetermined story, all unfolding according to God's will. And that the speaking is happening according to God's will, the thinking is happening according to God's will. What I mean by God's will is life. So we could say that, because it sounds like God's will, meaning there is a God with a will, and he's inflicting that will on you and me. Not what is meant by God's will. God is a placeholder name in this teaching, as I am putting it forward, a placeholder name for source. Source is that from which all of this came. And we don't need to know what source is. In fact, because we could say we can't know what source is, because source is essentially not the source we're talking about, that from which this came, is outside of this, and we are part of this. So for an object within the manifestation to know the source would require the object to jump out of the manifestation and have an independent existence outside of the manifestation. And just like a dream character in the night dream can't jump out of the dream and walk around the bedroom, it doesn't get to exist on the bedroom dimension. So it doesn't, the night character dream never gets to bump into the dreamer of the dream. So we could say that God or source, in its fundamental, and even this is, it's not as linear as I might be putting forward, is outside. So we don't know what God is in its original state. So for that purpose, in the conceptual framework, God is, in its original state, is referred to as absolute potentiality. Nothing. But not dead nothing, potential nothing. And why it's referred to as potential nothing is because relative to the entity in the manifestation that is asking, what is God? Who is God? The answer, whether it's not that it's the absolute truth that God is nothing, but because the character can never know God, the right answer in the model is that prior to the manifestation, or outside of the manifestation, God is pure potentiality, absolute nothing. But that then creates this notion that there is the manifestation and God outside of the manifestation, which is not helpful as the model for us to work with. So that absolute potential nothing at some point turns into the manifestation. So God at rest, consciousness at rest, you could say, source at rest, is prior to the manifestation absolute nothing, pure potentiality. But because it's pure potentiality, it has to turn into, at some point, its potential, which is the manifestation. So we could say that point where it turns from potential to actualized is what we could refer to as the Big Bang, where the universe of time and space started to, or came into existence. And so you and I exist within the universe of time and space, which we can refer to as the manifestation or consciousness and movement. So potential energy at some point becomes kinetic energy. Potential energy is energy in its resting, unmanifested state. That's what the word potential refers to. And at some point, potential has to actualize, which means turn into kinetic energy or energy in movement. And so the universe is the energy of source in its moving state. That's creation. And so you and I and the theoretical 7 billion other humans and trees and oceans and planets and whatever are all the expression of God. So God in movement is the movement of the wave, and the present moment is the wave in the present moment. So the universe in the present moment is God in action, source in action. And so what comes next is God in action. So everything is happening according to God's will, which really means everything is happening according to God in action, according to source in movement. So the words, the thoughts, the emotions, the wind, the sun is God in action. That's God's will. It's the universe is not as it is because it's my will. Roger and Roger's will as an idea or an intention to do something is all God's will. And if we can have the attitude that everything is God's will, it means we can live life silently and still on the psychological level. Because the noise and agitation on the psychological level is always a narrative that doesn't see oneself as connected to and an expression of source, doesn't see life as an expression of source, doesn't see the other as an expression of source. And the commentary is saying, I can't be at peace and in harmony with this present moment. I have to be I am in resistance with it. And that resistance to it is saying, if only you as the doer had done it differently, then everything would be okay and life would be as it should be. And those psychological movements extend for years sometimes, holding on to the past for a long, long time. And as that happens, it contaminates the present moment. It contaminates the present moment with an attitude of regret about the past, or an attitude of blame and hatred towards the other for what happened in the past. And if we're not contaminating the present moment with regret and hatred, then we're often contaminating it with expectation and worry. And if we're not contaminating it, or rather, if God's will isn't contaminating it, but when I say we, God's will as an expression through us, if God's will isn't contaminating it with regret and hatred in the past and worry and expectation in the future, then it's contaminating it with complaints about the present. Until such time as God's will, meaning the story of life, starts to bring about change and an appreciation of what life is, brings about change in terms of an appreciation of the dynamics that lead to the speaking. So if instead of saying it's all happening according to God's will, which is just a very general way of saying it, or all are happening according to energy in motion or source in motion, we can also explain it on a more specific and causal explanation, that the words are coming out of the mouth because energy has put in place a specific body, mind organism with specific up-to-date conditioning. Meaning that God's will included a specific history of this person, and that movement through time is what resulted in the development of this human being exactly this way and these words coming out this way. So you can look at it either way, as a causal unfolding, and when we see the causality, it's impersonal physics, let's say, that leads to this. And we can also look at it as in each moment it's God's will in action. And ideally we can bring the two together and see, oh, it was God's will to have the specific physics the way it is. And so God's will unfolds causally, but the causal components are in place as they are because of God's will. And in the moment, the continuing unfolding of the predetermined story of life happens through each of us functioning, and that functioning happens because a thought arises and it feels like it's my thought. Like, I would like to have, an orange juice. So we could call that my will. But hopefully we realize that what we refer to as my will is part of God's will. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore that in practice, us getting an orange juice is preceded by a feeling that, oh, I feel like an orange juice, or I should have some vitamin C. I haven't had enough vitamin C this week. So we can say, in the moment, I am free. It feels like I'm free to have the orange juice or not have the orange juice. And so then we can reconcile that, oh, the unfolding of the predetermined story of life happens through myself and everyone doing exactly what we think or feel to do. And my will is not separate from God's will. So on a practical level, I say, in each moment, I'm free to do whatever I like. And from a step back point of view, I see that whatever I feel like doing, which we can call my free will, is actually God's will. So from this perspective, what we thought were contradictory concepts, God's will and my will, how can I have my will if everything is God's will? So it seems like no one of them has to fall away. However, we can start to see it that in practice, there is a thought or a feeling that feels like my free will, and yet attitudinally I can understand that what I feel and what feels like my free will is really God's will in action. Which means we can bring the two together and there can be a harmony that says my free will, my feeling of free will. So it's not really my actual free will, but the feeling of free will, the feeling that I can move my hand to the right or to the left, that I can have the orange juice or I could have the water. I'm free to do it based on whatever I feel like or whatever I think I should do. So that is my feeling of free will, and yet then I notice that what I feel like is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which was not in my control. So my free will and God's will are not two, which is a win-win, is that I get to do exactly what I feel like doing in practice, and attitudinally knowing that that was always God's will, which means no blame and hatred or shame to myself, because I realize that the outcome, the consequence, is also God's will unfolding. Now, going back to the person that has an issue with this description, one, they might have an issue because it doesn't make them feel like what they feel they need in order to be complete is going to be supported by this description. And the other reason that they might not like the sounds of this is that it sounds like what I'm saying is that I have no reason to function in a way that is responsible to society because it's all God's will. Whereas that explanation, the explanation I've just given, doesn't actually, to someone who understands it, doesn't lead to them functioning irresponsibly, because there is the simultaneous knowing that just because it's God's will doesn't mean that society isn't going to respond to whatever I do according to whether it delivers pleasure or pain to society. The truth is society will continue, even though everything is God's will, to reward me for those actions that are beneficial to society and punish me for those actions that are painful to society. So the understanding that everything is God's will is not an excuse to function irresponsibly, because if I did, I'd still get in trouble for it. So that attitude doesn't magically help me to get through life scot-free. I'm still going to be judged by society for those actions that happen through me that deliver pleasure to society and pain to society. Rewarded for the pleasure, the outcomes that deliver pleasure to society, and punished for the outcomes that deliver pain to society. What it does deliver, this attitude, is the end of regret and blame after the event, after the outcome has happened. So if I function in a certain way and it delivers a unfortunate circumstance, society will punish me. God won't punish me, because God understands that life is unfolding exactly according to destiny. And hopefully, if I have the right attitude, I won't add a load of uncomfortableness in the form of guilt and shame on top of the unfortunate circumstance that may have happened. That doesn't mean that I won't be apologetic or remorseful for an outcome that clearly is not favorable. The lack of shame doesn't mean I will ignore what has happened. So this attitude can still mean that there can be a remorse for outcomes that have delivered pain to people, not my intention to have hurt anyone. It doesn't lead to irresponsibility, because it doesn't magically absolve the person with that understanding from consequences from society. What it does is it alleviates the uncomfortableness of guilt and blame and pride and worry and anxiety and expectation that we've been carrying around our whole life. So we'll take some questions and see from there. Hi, Luca.
Hello. So I wanted to ask a question about consciousness. So there was a moment where I observed the functioning of the psychological me, and there was a definite. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a moment I was observing the functioning of the me, and I saw it, and I was, and the mind went, "I am not that. I am not that." And with this recognition, it was seen that the psychological me is just it's kind of like an energy signature in the body, and that the character, the personality of the body mind is not the problem. Neither is the body the problem, but it's the psychological me that attaches itself to the personality and warps it, and makes it really strange in some ways, and makes it really needy. So I had a question about consciousness in general, because there was a recognition, I am consciousness. And so is the spiritual process in general about consciousness recognizing that it is in fact not the psychological me, and then just re-identifying with itself? Is that kind of like that?
You could say that's very significant. I don't know whether I'd say it's all about that, but what you've described is very significant. One of the reasons I might say it's not all about that could be because there are some nuances in there that I wouldn't necessarily say are exactly right. So, for example, consciousness doesn't think. So
Yeah. I
consciousness
know.
can't say,
I wasn't implying that it does think.
good.
The thinking, consciousness doesn't do anything. It's, so to speak, there for the ride, if that makes sense. It doesn't have a say in anything.
Yeah, so in this case, when we're using the word consciousness, we're talking about the awareness faculty, right? Yeah. Because we can use the word consciousness also in different forms, like all there is consciousness. So consciousness turned into the rivers and the lakes. So we're talking about consciousness in the form of the awareness function. And yeah, so really the bit that the part of us that says I am not that, right, is part of the intellect.
Yes.
Yeah, let's say it could be the working mind. And you're not really the working mind either, but you're not the working mind. And you're not the thinking mind either.
Yeah.
So when the working mind comes up and says, I am not that, really what it's recognizing is that that is just a part of the human being.
Mm.
And the thinking that says, I am not that, is another part of the human being. And the awareness that is aware of the thinking mind and the working mind that says, I am not that, is another part of the human being. And from an integrated point of view, what happens is the thinking mind part atrophies. It as it's after it's been seen, I am not that. The investment in that thinking mind, the the attachment to outcomes and the doership, that gets weaker and weaker because we're not pumping energy that says this is who I am into it. So it gets weaker and weaker, and in the end, we're left as a human being. And so what is still there is the working mind, the thing that said I am not that. That's the body with its personality is still there, and the consciousness component is still there. And so what's there at the end of it is the human being, but the human being without the thinking mind that used to be part of the human being. And the shift from the human being that includes the thinking mind to the human being that no longer includes the thinking mind, the shift is inspired and helped along by that thought that you said, the thought of the working mind that says, I am not that, to the thinking mind, in relation to the thinking mind.
Okay. Yeah, that made a lot of sense. Thanks.
Good. So actually, experientially, what you said would make even more sense. What I mean by experientially, the way it feels is that awareness is aware of the thinking mind as a movement of thought. And in that moment, it feels like that is not what I am. I am the one aware of that thought. And that thought has always been there. And in the past, there has been an identification with the thought. And so what it feels like when it really does feel the way you described it, which is a realization, I am not the thinking mind. And so I just described it in sort of a more nuanced way, which is it's the working mind that jumps in and does a good job and realizes, oh, that's the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is where the belief in doership and attachment resides. And that belief in doership and attachment is an error, and it's not true. And so I can't be something that is not true. So these are just all different ways of phrasing it. So yeah, I think what you described is primarily what the shift is all about.
I also think that the teaching that you put forward was super, super helpful because it's so precise at identifying all of the functioning of the working mind. Of the thinking mind. And so it was really easy to it's really accurate, to pinpoint it. There it is. There it is again. There it is again. There it is again. There it is again. It's all day. It's just there it is again. There it is again. There it is again. And yeah, it's really, really helpful.
That is good. Did you find that, would you say that the word uncomfortableness with oneself is, I'm asking because I found that word uncomfortableness with oneself so aptly describes all of the different forms of suffering when we start to see them. We really do see that this word the inherent uncomfortableness with oneself is what it feels like.
Yeah, I'd say that's a good way to describe it in my case also, yeah. It's an I'm not okay with what's right now, give me something else, even though that something else doesn't exist.
Yes, exactly. Which can seem like on the surface an uncomfortableness with the other, or an uncomfortableness with life, an uncomfortableness with
it's all thinking generated. It has nothing to do with the circumstance.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, it's a attitude of resistance, but really, even though it seems like it's a attitude of not being okay with life, it really comes down to when we feel it, that really is an attitude of not being okay with oneself.
Excuse me, could you repeat the last thing? There was a big noise.
Yeah, even though we can say it's an uncomfortableness with the other, but even an uncomfortableness with the other, really, when we feel it, is an uncomfortableness with oneself.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Just go on.
If the thinking mind were to be completely gone, there would be absolutely no uncomfortableness. Where would it come from?
Yes, that's right. Very good.
Okay, it's pleasure as always.
Luca. How do we say it? Hello, Kuma.
Namaste, Roger. First of all, thank you so much for all your teachings and pointings. They're really helpful. So my question was, is enlightenment the art of mastering the acceptance of everything? Like a sense of abandon that whatever happens, let it happen? And a follow-up on that. So if everything in our life is predestined, so does that mean the only control we have by listening to these teachings and applying them is to be detached and accepting whatever happens, or that is also not in our control?
Yes, I would say that as a halfway house in a teaching will start off by saying, the only control you have, or the only thing you control is your attitude or your acceptance, because it's about essentially saying, okay, you can't control and things you can control. And by saying, okay, what you can control is your attitude or your acceptance, it's essentially moving attention onto that. And it's not talking to a doer or a controller, it's actually just new conditioning from outside impacting the body mind organism. And that information is bringing attention onto attitude or acceptance, non-acceptance. And as attention is on that, and we start to see because attention is on it, we start to see the non-acceptance, and we start to appreciate that the non-acceptance creates this resistance and this uncomfortableness. Then it makes sense that that's how it starts to, let's say, get interfered with, and the non-acceptance might shorten in duration and turn into acceptance as it gets cut off or as it gets shorter and shorter. And when that change is happening in the body-mind organism, it seems like I am, as the doer, choosing to accept rather than to resist. But as we look at it in more detail, we hopefully will start to realize it feels like I, the doer, am moving from doing non-acceptance to now doing acceptance. But that's still because we have this overarching attitude of personal doership, which applies to basically everything that happens in life. We think it happens because I did it. If we start to see that, no, life is always changing, things are always happening, but it's never because I'm doing it. And then we can sort of realize that even the change in attitude is not my doing, like you implied. That the change in attitude is also a happening because a teaching brought my attention to the attitude or the non-acceptance, And it brought my attention to it by using a concept that is strictly not completely true, which is what we've just discovered, because it said the only thing you are in control of is your attitude. That's not completely true, but it's useful as a teaching because it brings the attention onto that aspect. And so then hopefully we realize, well, even that was God's will. Even my attitude is not in my control. And so if you re-listen to the recording of your question, at the beginning you said, is it fair to say that enlightenment really is about coming to accept life? Well, actually, you probably didn't say, is it about coming to accept life, but rather there was in the wording, there was more of a sort of an attitude of doership towards acceptance, as in, is enlightenment about me accepting life? And there's two nuances I would point out. One is the fact that there is the presupposition that there is a me doer that does the accepting. And secondly, there is a presupposition that accepting is a verb, but is an active doing. Whereas when we investigate it, we find that acceptance is much more like forgetfulness. You don't do forgetfulness, right? Really what happens is remembrance doesn't happen. And so when remembrance doesn't happen, you say, oh, I forgot. But when you forget something, you don't, it's a very passive action. It's the non-happening of remembering. So you had an appointment at 10 o'clock, and then afterwards you say, oh, I forgot about my appointment. More accurately, it's I didn't remember. And accepting is not something that we are needing to do. It is the absence of resistance. So when the non-accepting or the resistance isn't there, by default, that is acceptance. So acceptance doesn't require us to embrace life. It just requires us not to fight life. So the absence of the fighting is acceptance. And if this nuance isn't understood, then we keep putting our attention on trying to accept things. Whereas how acceptance happens is when the non-acceptance gets the non-acceptance stops being as strong. So those are nuances, but by and large, I mean, I'm just picking. I pick on nuances, right? Because they are important. But by and large, what you put forward is pretty much on track. Do we have sound or?
Thank you so much. That was very helpful, because I noticed by saying the art of mastering acceptance, there is an ego which wants to master acceptance.
Yes, I think that's what I picked up on the art of mastering. Exactly, it's like I will become an expert at it, and acceptance is actually the absence of the wanting to be an expert, and in fact, the claiming, or if there is an expertise at some point where you see that you are very good at something, there won't be someone claiming it as an achievement in a sense, right? It will be clearly recognized that it's grace of God, it's the grace of God, or the grace of the story of life, that acceptance happens.
And the last thing, yesterday you beautifully pointed about a third stage of being human, I noticed that also when you're going through a spiritual process, you tend to be more egoistic and more ungrounded and in some la la land, but then you have to come back to life and apply that teaching in daily living. So that really resonated and helped.
Yes,
Thank you
that's
for your
good.
response.
Yeah, because it is very easy to, if we don't keep it real, if we don't bring it down to practical, um, a practical change, that's when the spiritual ego can kick in, and if we keep bringing it back to a practical change, then we'll realize when the spiritual ego has kicked in, because we will feel that there is an uncomfortableness. Whereas if the belief is that it's about being able to meditate for 3 hours a day, then the spiritual ego can kick in, because it's like, oh, I do meditate for 3 hours a day. But if it becomes about something practical, peace of mind, we will realize that that spiritual ego is uncomfortableness. And so then we'll catch it and go, oh, there's the pride. Yeah.
Yes, because I used to meditate long times, but I was narcissistic to my family around. Like there's a identity of being special or something, being a meditator, and that identity becomes claustrophobic.
Yeah. Funnily enough, my girlfriend sent me an article today, which I haven't read yet, but it said that it's been shown that yoga and meditation increases one's egoic narcissism. By and large, you know, so obviously if yoga and meditation become authentic yoga and meditation, i.e. where the yogi and the meditator dissolve and there is just yoga happening, just meditation happening, then clearly that's not what the study is showing. But it's saying that if you take 1,000 meditators or 1,000 yoga practitioners, a large percentage of those are going to have found that their egoic pride has and sense of superiority has increased rather than decreased. So, very good. Thank you for dropping in, Kumar.
Thank you so much. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Is it Becky? Hi, Becky.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Oh, thank you so much. I've been listening every day, and it's so helpful. And I feel like on a personal level, like I just feel like every day I get it a little bit more, and I have these little insights. And it's really, I can't thank you enough. It's just wonderful. It just so clicks for me. Like, yes, this is always what this is putting it together for me. Like you feel like you knew this, but you didn't have the words or you didn't have the structure. But here's where I'm having a real challenge. When I try to look at the world and I see so much suffering and so much chaos, so much turmoil, and there's all this, people are really looking at examining racism and how to look into ourselves and see where these dark, this stuff needs to come to light so that we can grow. It's a beautiful thing, but also there's so much going on that's it's so overwhelming. And I mean, the not doer who's a physical body is a big nut job who's in charge of everything. And I say to myself, but there is no doer. So what I'm trying to say is, like, when I'm looking at my personal life, this is all wonderful. But when I try to like step out even just a little bit, it all kind of starts falling apart, because I was wondering about what you said before during the talk about having I guess I'm asking about the sense of personal responsibility. You know, I mean, I know there's no doer, but you also have to be responsible to society. So then I wonder, well, then what is my, what is my role? Because I'm terribly anguished by, not just the suffering, but the sort of callousness to suffering that I see, where people say, well, those things really aren't happening, and those stories are made up, and those people really aren't suffering. And I just I you know I, I suppose I should stop watching the news, but it feels like it's just turning my back. So in other words, like I'm saying, if all I was, if all I had to do was live my little life, everything would just be wonderful, and it would all just be blossoming and unfolding. But I feel part of something larger, which I'm sure I am. And so I don't know how to, I need some guidance from you, please, on how to um, navigate, how to feel like I'm not just saying, well, it's all God's will, but you know what am I making sense?
Yes, you are.
Oh,
So the one thing we have to get our head around is sort of comprehending how is it, or why is it, that life has such unfortunate circumstance in it? Why are handicapped babies born? Why are people below the poverty line? Why are people getting ill and dying? And why is there cruelty? So this is something we often can't reconcile, because we have an idea that life is meant to be peaches and cream, because that's what we would like it to be, because we feel like that's when my happiness will be available. Because the truth is that we tend to feel uncomfortable in life. Life is not peaches and cream, and so we assume that my uncomfortableness is because life isn't peaches and cream, so I want it to be all good. So one of the starting foundations is for us to have a rationale that allows us to reconcile with life as it is being not broken. Like it's it's meant to be a mix of pleasure and pain. It's a duality. It's a creation of interconnected opposites, meaning health and disease, wealth and poverty, good and bad, big and small, hot and cold. These are all interconnected opposites. If you have one, you have to have the other. And so that is the life of duality. If it wasn't a creation of duality, then when duality arises, we could say, well, something's gone terribly wrong. But because it is a creation of duality, which is a creation of interconnected opposites, when we see the interconnected opposites, hopefully we can start to see, oh, life's working. Because this is a creation of duality, of interconnected opposites. So really what that means is, you can imagine if we take our investment or attachment out of the situation, and we imagine a novel called The Story of Life, or a movie, The Story of Life, or The History of Life. And it's a book written by a fiction or a non-fiction writer. Let's call it a fiction. So the book called The History of Life on Earth is there, and it includes everything that has happened in life to everyone. That is the novel. Now, when you look at it from a creative point of view, you go, wow, this is an amazing creative masterpiece. It is a story of, currently 7 billion plus people, and historically, I don't know how many billion of people have lived historically. And it's a creation that includes in it the details of every one of those lives and how they interconnect, and the evolution of all sorts of things, evolution of biology, evolution of technology, evolution of industry, evolution of ideas, evolution of spirituality, evolution of philosophy. So all of that is the story of life. Now, if we if we look at it, we go, wow, that's a fantastic, amazing masterpiece creation. A bit like a horror movie, although life isn't just a horror movie. Life is more like the drama genre. But if we look at horror movies are not peaches and cream, but they're a valid form of creative expression.
Mhm.
So life is a creative expression, a masterpiece of life, and that masterpiece is a story of time and space, a causality of human lives, of evolution, and it includes in it duality, interconnected opposites. So I think that's very important for us to attitudinally understand that when life is the way it is, it's not broken, it's the masterpiece of this particular creation. So that can give us a reason not to resist attitudinally. If that explanation, that attitude towards life isn't there, and we have the idea that life needs to be just pleasure, 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 and no pain, pain, pain mixed in the mix, then we're going to be attitudinally in resistance when we see all of these unfortunate circumstances on the news. When we see the unfortunate circumstances on the news with this attitude, it doesn't mean we won't feel sad, because when we see a sad situation, our emotion of sadness can be there. But the question, why does this happen, won't come up. We'll have sadness about the sadness of the event, but it will be, yeah, and this is life, that would be the attitude. So that makes sense so far?
It does. I guess what, I guess probably it would fall under the category of guilt as a person, is that I kind of feel like, well, that's easy for me to say because I'm not the one who's suffering, you know,
Mhm.
so I find it hard to I guess it's just all the conditioning, that you're responsible. And if you see things that are wrong, you're supposed to try to help. You're supposed to fix them. You're supposed to do whatever
Mhm.
you can. You're supposed to speak out against injustice. I mean, but you are still, right? If you feel that inclination, but you're saying if you do that, but just also recognize that the world isn't meant to be a perfect place. And I get that on a, like I said, personally, I really get that,
Mhm.
like,
So even if
but
we were the ones suffering, the description is simply, so what I'm putting out is a description of life. It's not because I describe life that way, doesn't make it like that because I say it's like that. It's the other way around. It's more like there is life, and let's look at it and see, oh, life is a mix of, there are amazingly kind acts that happen and amazingly unkind acts that happen. So
mhm,
that's just a description. It's not saying that's how I want it to be, or that's how it should be, or because I say it's like that, I'm going to influence it and make it like that. It's just a description of that's how life is. And I think everyone would have to agree, because the things I point out, health and disease, wealth and poverty, hot and cold, big and small, interconnected opposites, they simply are phenomena in life that we can't argue with. They're there.
mhm,
And wanting it to be different isn't necessarily going to change it. So I figure we might as well align with it and see it as it is. And then, as you said, that seeing it as it is doesn't prevent us from doing whatever we can to improve a situation. And so when you ask the question, the most useful thing I could say, which is actually what I believe, is that if you turn on the news and you watch the news and you watch, I don't know, wars in Syria and wars on the streets of in the US itself, at
Yes.
times, and poverty and people dying. If you turn it on and you get into debates with friends and you feel anxious and have a commentary about the unfairness of life, I mean, that's not contributing anything really to changing it.
Right.
What it's doing is it's making your life uncomfortable, and yet no contribution is happening. So let's take the question of world poverty. Practically speaking, I think this is the most integrated approach we can take, is we say, yes, life is a mix of pleasure and pain, a mix of interconnected opposites. So there is wealth, and then there's poverty. What is it that I can do if I'm looking to make an improvement? What is it I can actually do to improve that part of life? And the answer, I say, is that if you feel inclined, put in place a monthly donation, $100 or $10 or $1,000, whatever it is you can afford, with an organization that you know is set up with the right intention to try and improve the situation of world poverty. And then you don't need to think about it, except if at some point you want to increase your donation or decrease it because you can't afford it anymore. And
Okay.
that means you're actually doing something practical. So you're not sticking your head in the sand and saying poverty doesn't exist. And because you've done something practical and you know that you've done as much as you can given your circumstance, you don't need to think about it anymore. You can then say world poverty is too big a problem for Roger or Becky to solve. But Roger has done what he can. Becky has done what she can. And so that's all I need to do. And if at some point in the future you have an urge to go and work in an orphanage in India or something like that, by all means, do that when the time comes such that you feel like doing it. And that way you've done both things. You've got rid of the uncomfortableness that isn't serving a purpose, and you've practically put something in place that makes a difference.
Okay. So what if it's like, what if it's something, I think that actually the issue right now that has me really most distressed is racism. So, I mean, I could donate to organizations, and I do, but I mean, I guess, I guess what you're saying is whatever you do, it's accept that what is the way it's supposed to be. It's life unfolding. It's all interconnected. It can't be any other way than it is. And if I feel that only focus on if you can do something, then do it. But other than that, you have to be grounded in this acceptance and not just the anguish that I feel. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
is that, so then I guess maybe I was thinking this last night. I was wondering if I can get myself to that place, which is really hard because I feel like it's so strange. It feels like a betrayal. Like like I'm supposed to suffer too. So if I accept it, then, like, I know it sounds ridiculous, but if what I was thinking is kind of what you're saying. So if I can truly just really start to deepen into that acceptance of what is, then I probably would be more inspired to find things, to find ways to contribute in a positive, wholesome way to address issues, right? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And the irony is that in a lot of cases, is that engaging in a topic like, a lot of very charged topics that are in place because of doership and attachment, humanity's doership and attachment. So a lot of the issues that are currently in place and have been historical issues have been set in place because we have these egoic identities. And so the unraveling of that is something that needs to happen. And so that's what's taking place. and we think that by getting onto one side of that, we're helping. And the truth is that both sides, which are part of the dynamic of that issue, and it might seem like we're copping out or we're not helping by just disengaging in that movement, but that movement is that's playing out is the unraveling of that egoic issue. And what happens with egoic issues, it forces sides. There are two sides, and so this voice for usually there is the voice of the oppressed and the oppressors, and they sort of fight it out until it hopefully dissipates. And getting on the side of the voice of the oppressed is really not fixing the problem. It dissipates eventually when there are no more voices left. So if you can find yourself as not a voice and just step out of the ring, that's one less person in the ring. And that person that stepped out can only step out if they're not egoically part of the issue. So the more people that step out of the ring is actually the problem being solved. The problem really doesn't end up being solved because there are people fighting the oppressors. I mean, that's part of how it gets solved. But in the end, it doesn't get solved because there are a whole lot of victors. It gets solved because there's no one in the ring anymore. And I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but
it does. I guess it takes a lot of courage, and it's a certain leap of faith because, it's a lifetime of conditioning, upbringing and conditioning, and that. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. So, but it's just like it's a leap. To say, because then like when you talk to people, there's this feeling I have that, well, if I don't speak up, then I'm, if I don't say something, if somebody says something and it's really offensive, if I don't speak up, then I'm betraying. But you're saying if I don't speak up, then I'm one less contender that's perpetuating the problem. Right? Is that what you're saying?
It's exactly that. And the thing is, there is people will say, if you're not on the side of the oppressed, you're on the side of the oppressor. And I think that's very inaccurate. In a way, that's there to try and build up their side, thinking that, we will win this when the oppressed fight the oppressors. And as I say, in the end, it ends up being a cleared issue when everyone has stepped out of the ring. And so this assumption that if you're not on the side of the oppressed, you're on the side of the oppressors, is still this idea of being defined and having your sense of self as somewhere on the circumstantial spectrum. And you might have heard me say that my understanding of Buddha's middle way is not about being in the middle and being moderate about things. It's about stepping off the spectrum of being somewhere on the spectrum, and in stepping off, we then become the witness of life unfolding. And so it can be that if you're not on any side, you're just sticking your head in the ground. I'm not talking about sticking your head in the ground. I'm sort of where you realize this isn't my fight. I'm not contributing to this war. As in, not I'm choosing not to contribute. It's like I don't have that energy inside of me. So if you are not racist, then it's just not you're not involved in it. And so there'll be people that say, well, but I'm not racist and I'm involved in it. And the likelihood is that you're identified as a victim,
Mm-hmm.
not because of your doing, but because of the history. Your history hasn't been a history of being the oppressor, it's being the oppressed. And so you're forced to be in that fight, even if it's not about racism. It could be about feminism or some other minority. You might find yourself in a different minority and identified with that different minority. So you feel compelled to get into that fight, the fight of racism. But that's because the identity is identifying with being, in this case, the oppressed or an oppressed. And when that stops being the identity, you just simply, it's not your fight.
Okay. That's good. So then, like, just one last thing about it. So it's very close to home, the conflict about it, because say like my husband has a very different view than I do. And it really anguishes me. And I want to, sometimes like we really do get into, it's horrible. We get into these fights. And I really feel like if I don't say anything, then it's like I'm agreeing with him. So I feel like I have to do something to make a transition, like maybe say, look, I just want you to know I'm not going to say anything about this anymore because I'm adopting I'm looking at everything is unfolding and I'm not going to be part of this. So if I'm not saying anything anymore, it's not because I agree with you, it's because I'm just not, I'm stepping out of the ring. Do you think that would be a good thing to do?
Yes, I mean, or you can say, look, I find this causes conflict, so let's not bring this topic up if we can avoid it, and maybe that can work.
Okay, all right. Well, I am going to do some real contemplating of that everything is unfolding perfectly. Sometimes like I remember being really young and sometimes having flashes of that. I would just be sitting on a crowded, smelly bus in the middle of the summer and just look out and say, you know what, everybody is just perfect. Everything is just perfect. And like when it's just your direct day-to-day personal experience, it's so easy to do that. To just like see the absolute beauty and harmony and everything. You could be in a crowded grocery store and it's like a dance. You just say, everything is so beautiful. Everything is perfect. So
Yeah.
I guess if I have that foundation, then I guess I already have that. And it's just a matter of not seeing this separation I've created in my mind about it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so let's also be clear that when we say everything is beautiful and everything is perfect, what we really mean is everything's in order, because we don't want to get into a delusion. I found myself at some point really saying it's all good was one thing, as part of the process going back. I found, if anyone said, "Oh, I'm sorry for being late," I go, "Oh, it's all good. It's all good." Even if
Even if
I
it's
broke my
not.
leg, let's say, and someone said, "I'm sorry for that." Oh, it's all good. And what I was expressing really is that one can have an attitude to that isn't in resistance to it. But then when I started seeing, oh, but actually, some of these things are not actually good. Just like when we say it's perfect, we're talking about our attitude can be an attitude that is not in resistance to it. But we're not saying that life is, perfumed on a
Right, yeah.
circumstantial level. Or it is perfumed, but it's perfumed with the nice perfumes and the not so nice perfumes.
Mhm.
But and I know that's what you meant. But when we say that in spirituality without clarifying it, we can be subject to being called deluded, right? And not seeing the
Yes,
actuality.
yes.
Yeah,
Yes, thank
so
you. Thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate it. That makes a lot of sense to me, and that's very important. Thank you so much. You just can't even imagine how much you're helping. And
thank you.
and and if you think about like just the people that will affect of how this is going out into the world, each of us listening, that our lives are changing and we're changing and we're affecting people, and just I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Roger. Bless you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.